In the last video, you learned the notes of the musical scale and how to find any note on the guitar fretboard. In this video, you will learn how the major scale is constructed and how to build a map of how to find any major scale on a guitar. The scale patterns you will learn today are not the ones that are usually taught in most guitar tuition videos or textbooks. But once you have learned them, you will be able to play any major scale. More importantly, you will have a map to unlock the other 7 musical modes and many other variations of the musical scale. You have already heard the C major scale in the first video in this series. It is built upon the 7 scale steps, using the white notes on a piano. On a piano, the C major scale is really easy to find, and after this lesson, it will be exactly the same for you on a guitar. We need to find the same 7 notes. We also need to understand the intervals between the scale notes that make the major scale sound the way that it does. So let's start on C, the first note of the scale octave. As we move between C and D, we have to move a whole tone. We call this a whole step because it passes 2 semitones to get to D. One to get to C sharp or D flat, which we don't play in this key, and the next semitone up is D, which we do play. So a whole step means a distance of 2 semitones. As we move from D to E, it is exactly the same. It takes a whole step or 2 semitones to get to the next note of the major scale. Between E and F, it is 1 half step or 1 semitone because there is no E sharp. Remember, B blunt, E is blunt. Between F and G, it is a whole step. Between G and A, it is another whole step. And between A and B, it is yet another whole step. It is only when we get to B, which is also blunt, that the interval between the 7th note of the scale and the 8th, C, which is the second half step in the major scale. If we map out the intervals between the notes of the C major scale octave, you find that it follows a clear pattern. 2 whole steps, followed by a half step, then another 3 whole steps, and finally a second half step before we get back to C. If we label this 2, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 1, you can see a repeating pattern. If I put a bracket around the middle 2, it is really easy to remember. The numbers tell you how many semitones you need to move to get to the next note on a piano, or on a guitar, the number of frets that you need to move up the neck to get to the next note of the major scale. So let's find this for the C major scale. You finished the last lesson by building a map of the notes on a guitar neck that looks something like this. I asked you to highlight the C's because we will use them to find the other notes of the scale. Let's start with the C on the 8th fret of the 6th string. Using the 2-2-1, 2-2-2-1 formula, the next note is 2 frets higher, D. On the 10th fret, the note after that is also 2 frets higher, E on the 12th fret. The next note is 1 fret higher, F, because E is blunt and has no sharp. I don't want you to play F on the 13th fret. I want you to play it on the 8th fret of the 5th string. The note after that is also 2 frets higher, G on the 10th fret. The next scale degree is also 2 frets higher, A on the 12th fret. We could play the next note, B, 2 frets higher, but in this pattern it is easier to play it on the 9th fret of the 4th string. The final interval is a single fret or semitone to get from B to C to complete the scale octave. This pattern gives us the 8 scale degrees of a major scale. I'll play them up and down, showing you it in both guitar tab notation and exactly as I play it on my fretboard. you need to memorise the shape, which scale degree is on which note, and the names of the notes. It is actually a really easy shape to remember. Now let's move to the next C. The C on the 8th fret of the 6th string is exactly the same note as the C on the 3rd fret of the 5th string. Now this is what makes it easy. The C major scale shape starting on this note is exactly the same as the last one you just learned. With one simple shape, you have learned the C major scale across nearly half of the guitar fretboard. Now let's move to the next C on the map. It is on the 10th fret of the 4th string. If we find the next two notes of the scale using the 2-2 formula, we find D and E on the 12th and 14th frets. If we move another step, we get to F on the 15th fret. But like before, we will play it on the next string. That is the 10th fret of the 3rd string. It is another 2 frets to get to G on the 12th fret of the 3rd string, and another 2 to get to A on the 14th fret. So far, the pattern is exactly the same as the last two. Where it changes is on the next note, B. We could play it on the 16th fret of the 3rd string, but we won't. We will move up another string to the 2nd string. On every string on the guitar, any note we play on one string appears 5 frets lower on the next higher string. The exception to this is between the 2nd and the 3rd strings, where there are only 4 frets or 4 semitones of a difference. You should have noticed this when you were mapping the notes out on the guitar fretboard in the last session. So to get to the next note, B on the 2nd string, we have to play the 12th fret. The final note of the octave C is only a half step away on the 13th fret. So let's play the whole pattern. If we compare the previous pattern in blue with this one in green, you see the only difference is that the notes are shifted up by 1 semitone or 1 fret on the 2nd string. Apart from that, the pattern is incredibly similar. Let's move to the final position, starting on the C on the 5th fret of the 3rd string. Following the same formula, we find D and E on the 7th and 9th frets. Like before, let's move up a string to get to the F. But because there is one less note between the 2nd and 3rd strings, we find the F on the 6th fret, not the 5th, as on the other lower strings. The G is 2 frets higher on the 8th fret, and the A 2 frets higher on the 10th fret. It is easy to find the final B. It is a semitone below the C on the 7th fret of the 1st string, finishing with C on the 8th fret. So let's label the 8 degrees of the scale and play the final pattern. Now let's compare this new shape with the original one in blue. The lowest pattern is the same as the others, but the next pattern on the 1st and 2nd strings is moved up by 1 fret. So there you have it, 3 simple shapes to navigate the major scale across most of the guitar neck. What you need to do now is label all of the notes in the patterns, and also the other notes of the scale as they appear outside of these shapes. For the C major scale, these are all the natural notes, with no sharps or flats. just like the white notes on a piano. In the next lesson, we will reapply this to find the notes of a completely different major scale, F major. Thanks for watching.